Everything you learned in school about American history was carefully edited. Some facts were exaggerated, others were completely made up. And the most interesting parts? They were left out entirely. Today we're exposing the biggest lies that made it into your history textbooks. Lie number 1. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Let's start with the most famous lie in American history. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, right? Wrong. On so many levels. First, you cannot discover a place where millions of people already live. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas, there were somewhere between 50 to 100 million indigenous people already living across the Americas. They had cities, governments, trade routes, and civilizations that were thousands of years old. But it gets worse. Columbus never even set foot in North America. Not once. His 4 voyages took him to the Caribbean islands and briefly to Central and South America. He died believing he had found a route to Asia. He had no idea he had stumbled onto a continent Europeans didn't know existed. And here's the part they really don't teach you. Columbus was not a hero. Not even close. When he arrived in the Bahamas, he encountered the Taino people. These were peaceful islanders who greeted him with gifts and hospitality. Columbus wrote in his own journal that they were gentle and generous. His response? He immediately started planning how to enslave them. Within decades, the Taino population was nearly extinct. Historians estimate that of the 250,000 Taino people living in the Caribbean when Columbus arrived, fewer than 500 remained by 1550. Disease played a role, but so did brutal slavery, torture, and murder. Columbus himself was so cruel that he was actually arrested by the Spanish crown and brought back to Spain in chains. Even by the standards of the 1500s, his treatment of indigenous people was considered excessive. So why do we celebrate him? The Columbus myth was largely created in the 1800s when Italian Americans were facing heavy discrimination. They needed a hero in American history, and Columbus, being Italian, fit the bill. Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus cemented many of the myths, including the completely false story that Columbus proved the earth was round. Educated people in 1492 already knew the earth was round. They had known for over 1,000 years. Lie number 2. The Pilgrims and the First Thanksgiving. The story you learned goes something like this. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, nearly starved during a harsh winter, and were saved by friendly Native Americans who taught them to grow corn. In gratitude, they all sat down together for the first Thanksgiving in 1621, and everyone lived happily ever after. The real story is much darker. First, the Pilgrims were not the first Europeans in the area. English, French, and Spanish explorers had been visiting New England for over a century. They had been kidnapping Native Americans and selling them into slavery and introducing diseases that devastated the population. When the Pilgrims landed, they found recently abandoned Native American villages. The Wampanoag people had been wiped out by a plague, likely smallpox introduced by European traders just a few years before. The Pilgrims literally moved into dead people's homes and raided their graves for corn and supplies. The Wampanoag who survived didn't help the Pilgrims out of kindness alone. They were in a desperate political situation. The plague had killed up to 90% of their people. Their rival tribes were now more powerful. They needed allies, and the Pilgrims, with their guns, seemed useful. The leader who made this decision was Massasoit. The interpreter who made it possible was Squanto, who spoke English because he had been kidnapped by English slavers years earlier, sold in Spain, escaped, made his way to England, and finally returned home only to find his entire village dead from disease. The 1621 harvest celebration did happen, but it wasn't called Thanksgiving, and it wasn't an annual tradition. It was a 3-day political festival with about 50 Pilgrims and 90 Wampanoag men. We don't actually know what they ate. Turkey might have been served, but the Pilgrims' own accounts mention venison and fowl. No mention of cranberry sauce, stuffing, or pumpkin pie. The darker part comes later. Just one generation after that 1621 meal, the Pilgrims' children went to war with the Wampanoag in King Philip's War. It was one of the bloodiest wars in American history relative to population size. The Wampanoag leader, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, was killed and beheaded. His head was displayed on a spike in Plymouth for 25 years. His wife and son were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The modern Thanksgiving holiday wasn't established to honor that 1621 meal. It was declared by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, as a way to unite the country. The Pilgrims story was attached to it later as part of creating a national mythology. Lie number 3. George Washington and the cherry tree. I cannot tell a lie, I cut down the cherry tree. Every American knows this story. It's been told for over 200 years to teach children about honesty. There's just one problem. It never happened. The story was completely made up by a bookseller named Mason Locke Weems, who wrote a biography of Washington published in 1800, shortly after Washington's death. Weems created the cherry tree story out of thin air to sell books. And it worked. His book became a bestseller. Weems invented other stories too, including one about Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac River, which is physically impossible. But the cherry tree story stuck because it was told to children in schools for generations. The real George Washington was far more interesting than the myth. He was an ambitious man who made military mistakes early in his career that helped start the French and Indian War. He married one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, which made him rich. He owned over 300 enslaved people. He had terrible teeth, but they weren't wooden. His dentures were made from a combination of animal teeth, ivory, and teeth pulled from enslaved people. Washington struggled with the morality of slavery throughout his life, but only freed his enslaved workers in his will after his death, and even then, only the ones he personally owned. The enslaved people who belonged to his wife's family remained enslaved. He was a skilled politician and a unifying figure who probably saved the young nation by refusing to become a king when he easily could have. But he was also a flawed human being, not the marble statue we've turned him into. Lie number 4. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. The British are coming. The British are coming. Everyone knows Paul Revere made a dramatic midnight ride to warn the colonists that the British were attacking. We know it from the famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, written in 1860. The problem is, almost none of it is accurate. Paul Revere didn't ride alone. He was one of several riders that night, including William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. Revere didn't shout, "The British are coming," because the colonists still considered themselves British. He would have said, "The regulars are coming out," referring to the British regular army. More importantly, Revere didn't complete his mission. He was captured by a British patrol before reaching Concord. He was questioned, released without his horse, and had to walk back to Lexington. It was Samuel Prescott who actually made it to Concord to warn the militia. So why do we remember Paul Revere instead of Samuel Prescott? Because Longfellow wrote a poem about him 85 years later. Longfellow needed a hero for his poem about American courage, and Paul Revere sounded better than Samuel Prescott. The poem became famous and cemented a myth. The real story of that night is more complex and involves careful planning by the Sons of Liberty, a network of riders, and several men risking their lives. But that doesn't fit neatly into a simple hero story. Lie number 5. The Civil War was about states' rights. This is perhaps the most damaging lie still being taught in some American schools. The claim is that the Civil War was fought over states' rights and economic differences between North and South, with slavery being a minor side issue. This is completely false, and we don't have to guess about it. The Confederate states told us explicitly why they were seceding. South Carolina, the first state to secede, published a Declaration of the Immediate Causes for Secession. It mentions slavery 18 times in the first 3 paragraphs. The document complains that northern states aren't returning escaped enslaved people, and that the North won't allow slavery to expand into new territories. Mississippi's declaration is even more direct. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration stated that the North had announced the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, which Georgia found unacceptable. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gave a speech in 1861 now known as the Cornerstone Speech. He said the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. It couldn't be clearer. The Civil War was about slavery. Full stop. The states' rights myth was created after the war as part of the lost cause narrative, a revisionist history that painted the Confederacy as noble defenders of Southern culture rather than traitors fighting to preserve slavery. This narrative was pushed for over a century through textbooks, monuments, and movies like Gone with the Wind. The consequences of this lie are still with us today. It prevents honest discussion about race in America and perpetuates a false nostalgia for the Confederacy. Lie number 6. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator who freed the slaves. While Lincoln deserves credit for the Emancipation Proclamation and supporting the 13th Amendment, the real story is more complicated. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1, 1863, didn't actually free all enslaved people. It only declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate states that were still in rebellion. It specifically exempted border states loyal to the Union and areas of the Confederacy already under Union control. This meant that on January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't immediately free a single enslaved person. It only applied to areas where Lincoln had no power to enforce it. It was primarily a military strategy designed to weaken the Confederacy and prevent Britain and France from supporting the South. Lincoln's personal views on race were complex. He opposed slavery, but didn't believe in racial equality by modern standards. In his famous debates with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln stated, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." Lincoln supported colonization plans to send freed black Americans to Africa or Central America. He met with black leaders in 1862 to try to convince them that black people should leave America after the war. His views evolved over time, especially after meeting with abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. By the end of his life, he was supporting limited voting rights for black men, particularly those who had served in the Union Army. The real heroes of abolition were the enslaved people who escaped, the black and white abolitionists who fought for decades before the war, and the nearly 200,000 black soldiers who fought for the Union. Lincoln was an important political leader who ultimately did the right thing, but he wasn't a saint, and he wasn't alone. Lie number 7. America was founded on religious freedom. The story we learn is that Pilgrims fled religious persecution in England and founded America as a place of religious freedom. Therefore, America was established on principles of religious tolerance. The reality is much messier. The Pilgrims who founded Plymouth didn't leave England because they were being persecuted. They left because England wasn't religious enough for them. They were radical Puritans who thought the Church of England was too Catholic. They first moved to Holland, which had actual religious freedom, but they didn't like it there because it was too tolerant. Their children were learning Dutch and adopting Dutch customs. When they established Plymouth and later Massachusetts Bay Colony, they absolutely did not practice religious freedom. They created strict religious governments where only church members could vote. They banned celebrating Christmas because it was too Catholic. They executed Quakers for the crime of being Quakers. In 1659 and 1661, Massachusetts hanged 4 Quakers on Boston Common simply for repeatedly returning to the colony after being banished. One of them was Mary Dyer, who is now honored with a statue for her stand for religious freedom, but at the time she was killed by a government founded by people supposedly fleeing religious persecution. Roger Williams, one of the Pilgrims, was banished from Massachusetts for suggesting that maybe the government shouldn't force everyone to follow the same religion. He founded Rhode Island, which actually did practice religious freedom. The Founding Fathers, more than a century later, were largely not religious fundamentalists. Many were deists who believed in God but not in organized religion. When they wrote the Constitution, they deliberately left religion out of it. The only mention of religion in the original Constitution is Article 6, which bans religious tests for public office. The First Amendment's protection of religious freedom wasn't based on the Pilgrim tradition. It was a radical departure from it. Lie number 8. Betsy Ross made the first American flag. The story goes that George Washington personally visited seamstress Betsy Ross in Philadelphia and asked her to make the first American flag with stars and stripes. She suggested 5-pointed stars instead of 6-pointed stars, and the iconic flag was born. Great story. No evidence it ever happened. The Betsy Ross story first appeared in 1870, almost a century after the supposed event. It was told by her grandson William Canby to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. He had no documents or evidence, just a family story told to him when he was a child. Historians have found no evidence that George Washington visited Betsy Ross. No contemporaneous accounts mention her making the first flag. Washington was busy with the Continental Army and wasn't even in Philadelphia at the time the flag was supposedly commissioned. We don't actually know who designed the first Stars and Stripes. It may have been designed by a committee. It may have been Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, who claimed to have designed it and submitted a bill for his services. Betsy Ross was a real person and a real seamstress. She may have made flags during the Revolution, but there's no evidence she made the first one or that she had any special role in its design. So why do we believe the story? Because it's a nice story. It gives a role to a woman in the founding of the nation, which was otherwise dominated by men in the historical narrative. And like many myths, it was repeated so many times in schools and books that it became accepted as fact. Lie number 9. The Founding Fathers were all Christians who wanted a Christian nation. This is a modern political myth used to argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. While many founders were Christians, several of the most influential were not, at least not in any conventional sense. Thomas Jefferson rejected most of traditional Christianity. He literally cut up a Bible with scissors, removing all the miracles and supernatural elements, leaving only the moral teachings of Jesus. The Jefferson Bible ended with Jesus' death, removing the resurrection entirely. Benjamin Franklin expressed doubts about divinity of Jesus in his autobiography. He attended various churches but wasn't committed to any particular doctrine. Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense was crucial in rallying support for independence, wrote The Age of Reason, which attacked organized Christianity and the Bible. George Washington almost never mentioned Jesus Christ in his voluminous correspondence. He talked about providence and the Almighty, but in vague deistic terms. James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution and the First Amendment, strongly opposed government involvement in religion. He opposed government-funded chaplains and even government-funded days of prayer. John Adams signed the Treaty of Tripoli in 1797, which explicitly stated, "The government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion." The Constitution itself is a secular document. It begins with "We the people," not "we the people under God." It contains no references to God, Jesus, or Christianity. The only references to religion are the ban on religious tests for office and the First Amendment's protections. "In God We Trust" wasn't added to currency until the Civil War. "Under God" wasn't added to the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954 during the Cold War. The Founding Fathers created a secular government on purpose. They had seen centuries of religious warfare in Europe and wanted to prevent it in America. They protected religious freedom by keeping government out of religion, not by establishing a Christian nation. Lie number 10. Manifest destiny was America's noble mission. In the 1800s, Americans were taught that it was their manifest destiny to expand across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was presented as a noble mission to spread democracy and civilization. Manifest destiny was propaganda used to justify conquest, broken treaties, and genocide. When Americans moved into Texas, it was part of Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery, so American settlers brought enslaved people illegally. When Mexico tried to enforce its own laws, American settlers rebelled and took Texas. The Mexican-American War was started under false pretenses. President James Polk sent troops into disputed territory hoping to provoke an attack, which he could then use as justification for war. It worked. The United States took half of Mexico's territory, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Congressman Abraham Lincoln, at the time, called out this lie. He introduced the spot resolutions demanding that Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil, as Polk claimed. Polk never answered because the incident had happened in disputed territory. But the real victims of Manifest Destiny were Native Americans. Treaties were signed and broken repeatedly. Andrew Jackson defied a Supreme Court ruling to force the Cherokee out of Georgia in the Trail of Tears, which killed thousands. As Americans moved west, they systematically pushed Native Americans off their lands. The California Gold Rush led to genocide of California Native Americans. The state of California paid bounties for Native American scalps and body parts. The native population of California dropped from about 150,000 in 1848 to about 30,000 by 1870. The Plains Indians were conquered through a deliberate strategy of destroying buffalo herds. Millions of buffalo were slaughtered, many just for their tongues or for sport, to deprive Native Americans of their primary food source. By 1890, the frontier was declared closed. Native Americans had been confined to reservations, their population reduced by over 90% from pre-contact numbers. This wasn't destiny. It was policy. Why these lies matter? You might be wondering why any of this matters. These are old stories. What difference does it make what we believe about Columbus or Betsy Ross? It matters because the lies we tell about history shape how we see the present. If you believe Columbus was a hero who discovered America, you're less likely to understand why Indigenous Peoples Day matters. If you believe the Civil War was about states' rights, you're less likely to understand systemic racism. If you believe America was always a land of freedom and opportunity, you're less likely to acknowledge the people who were enslaved, displaced, or excluded from that promise. History isn't just about the past. It's about who we are now, and who we want to become. The truth is that American history is complicated. The founders created a revolutionary system of government while owning slaves. America has been both a beacon of freedom and a perpetrator of oppression. We've made incredible progress and committed terrible crimes. The real American story is not about flawless heroes, but about flawed people slowly, painfully, expanding the definition of who counts as equal. It's about enslaved people who fought for their freedom, women who demanded the vote, workers who organized for rights, and activists of every generation who pushed America to live up to its ideals. That story is more inspiring than any myth, because it's true. It tells us that progress is possible but not inevitable. It has to be fought for. When we teach sanitized myths instead of complex truths, we rob young people of the real lessons of history. We teach them that great things are done by flawless heroes rather than by ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things despite their flaws. We also teach people to distrust history altogether. When someone learns that something they were taught in school was a lie, they often conclude that everything must be a lie. This creates cynicism and makes people vulnerable to conspiracy theories. The antidote is not more comfortable lies, but uncomfortable truths. American history is full of inspiring stories that are actually true. The freedom riders who faced violence to challenge segregation, the workers who fought for the 8-hour workday, the suffragists who spent decades fighting for the vote, the scientists and engineers who put humans on the moon. These stories don't need to be exaggerated or whitewashed. They're incredible as they are. The truth is always better than a lie, even when it's complicated, even when it's uncomfortable. That's the real lesson we should teach. So the next time someone tells you a neat, simple story about American history with clear heroes and villains, ask questions. Look deeper. The real story is usually messier, more complicated, and more interesting. Because the biggest lie of all is that history is simple. It never is.